president of European Horizons at Carolina. We're an on-campus think tank. Thank you so much for coming to our end of semester panel. We are so happy to have you here. This panel has been my pet project for the last few months, and the question of what is Europe, I think, is deceptively simple. It's a simple question with far-reaching implications and maybe a not-so-simple answer. Before we start, I'd like to give special thanks to a few people. First off, Sarah Hutchison and Katie Lindner, respectively, the Executive Director of the Translating Masters Program and the Director of the Center for European Studies. Thank you so much for your support and for co-sponsoring this event with us. We would also like to thank Irvin Stronsberg and the University of Gothenburg for our funding for this year. Lovely food in the back is courtesy of the Swedish University of Gothenburg. We would also like to thank Stephanie Shady and Lily Herbert for their spectacular work in helping us get this together. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Dr. Brett Whalen is the Director of Undergraduate Studies here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Department of History. He received his PhD from Stanford, and his research focus is in Christian, intellectual, and cultural history during the High Middle Ages. His first monograph, The Dominion of God, Christendom and Apocalypse in the Middle Ages, explores the medieval belief that Christianity would spread to every corner of the earth before the end of time. Tonight he's going to be talking some about the origins of the idea of Europe. Dr. John Pickles is the Earl N. Phillips Distinguished Professor of International Studies at the Department of Geography here at UNC. He received his PhDs, plural, from the University of Natal and the Pennsylvania State University. Professor Pickles is an economic geographer trained in political economy and development studies, cultural and social theory, and continental philosophy. His research currently focuses on global production networks, European economic and social spaces, particularly post-socialist transformations in Central Europe, and Euro-Med neighborhood policies in Southern Europe. He also works on cultural economies of maps, mapping, and counter-mapping, and the use of maps in social movements. Dr. Christiane Lemke is a professor of political science and director of international relations and European studies in the Institute of Political Science in Leibniz University, Hanover. From 2010 to 2014, she held the Max Weber Chair at New York University. Professor Lemke received her PhD from the Faculty of Philosophy and Social Sciences at the Free University of Berlin, and went on to earn her habilitation Venia Legendi in political science from the same institution. Professor Lemke has been a visiting scholar at a number of U.S. institutions over the years as she has maintained her permanent faculty position in Germany. She's taught courses at UNC Chapel Hill, Stanford University, Harvard University, and Suffolk University. A few notes, if you're coming in late or if you want some food, try not to interrupt the filming, which will be right there. Please hold all of your questions until the Q&A section at the end. And without further ado, Dr. Whalen, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Great. Well, good night, everyone. I'm really impressed with the turnout this late in the evening. Before I start, I want to thank Gray for inviting me to be on this panel. It's particularly gratifying as an undergraduate student here. Gray was in 3 of my classes, so I know I'm not just like a token medievalist at this event. Like, you are seriously committed to the Middle Ages. It's also wonderful now with you as a graduate student that you're now inviting me to do stuff having an impact on my academic life on campus. So thank you. I'm also glad to be here, especially here being involved with the Center for European Studies, because as we've discussed, and I've discussed with a number of people involved in the center, my understanding is due in part to the funding of some of the funding sources for European studies, that there's an explicit definition or focus on Europe as a modern phenomenon, and medieval is not really considered part of the, typically not considered part of the mandate for the discussions of Europe. But I think medievalists have a lot to say about the question of Europe, and should be part of that discussion, so I'm delighted to be able to join in, particularly this evening. What is Europe? I have no idea. I mean, let me just throw that out right up front. I have no idea, and I'm going to offer no definitive statement about it in the next 15 minutes. However, one possible answer to the question, one popular answer to the question of what is Europe, one that has had a lot of currency in the academic world and in the political world for centuries, really, for many, many years, is that Europe is some sort of secularized form of medieval Christian Europe, that is to say, call it Christendom, if you will. And that somehow the unity of Europe, whatever European identity is, whatever Europe, whatever the nature of Europe is, can be traced back to Christendom and the European Middle Ages. And that's what I want to talk about tonight with the time allotted to me. Let me give sort of 2 caveats up front here. First of all, one, like, no one agrees on what Europe is now. I imagine we're going to hear more about this from my fellow panelists and in the Q&A. Gray, you already alluded to this. It's a deceptively simple question, but it's a really difficult one to answer. The borders of Europe, the essence of European culture, if there is such a thing. What is it? Is it rising? Is it declining? These are all sort of contested questions. It's interesting, I arrived here in 2005, and when I got here, there was still this sense when I discussed the idea of Europe in the context of the Middle Ages, there was really this sense of ascendancy for the European Union. Of course, a lot of that changed with the financial crisis in 2008 and subsequent discussions up to the present. And so I think even the understanding of what Europe is in the present has really shifted among my students in the 14 years I've been teaching here at Carolina. So there's no real sense of what Europe is, so as soon as you start talking about the origins of Europe in the Middle Ages, you're kind of falling into this intellectual trap, right? If you're looking for the origins of something, it presupposes that it actually coheres and exists, and I think we need to be wary of that. The second thing I'm going to mention as a kind of caveat, make sure this works. How are we doing? Here we go. I'm not going to tell you that Christendom forms the origins to Europe tonight in any sort of historical reality. I think there's an argument to be made, or there are arguments or discussions that are worth having about this. That is to say that there might actually be some significant, meaningful historical continuities between ideas, aspects of culture, institutions from the Middle Ages, particularly back, say, in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, up until the modern era in European history. I think those arguments can be there, and they've certainly been made by a lot of European scholars. If you're thinking about parliamentary government, or thinking about institutions like the university. I mean, we're all at a university at this exact moment, right? And I think there's a certain level of logic and a certain historical validity to talking about connections between the modern-day university and the institution of the university that started in the 13th century, places like France, Italy, and England. Likewise with legal traditions, you can trace back certain legal intellectual traditions back to the Middle Ages. So I think those conversations can be had, certainly not in 15 minutes. And I think, too, we always need to be somewhat skeptical of them. My general rule of thumb as a medievalist is that if you want to understand the origins of a modern phenomenon, you should look very carefully at the last 50 years, the last 100, maybe 150, 200 years. First, before you start having discussions about things that happened 700, 800 years ago. I think those continuities are there, but I think we need to avoid essentializing things like the definition of Europe, and then very sort of in a slipshod, easy manner looking for their origins back in the Middle Ages. So I'm not going to argue that Christendom somehow formed the origins of Europe, but I do want to present with the time I have tonight the claim, or the argument, or the insistence, if you will, that the Christian Middle Ages formed the bedrock for Europe. This is as I mentioned, kind of popular, enduring idea with a great deal of currency that really cuts across the political spectrum. It's invoked by medievalists and professional scholars who study the Middle Ages, like myself, but also by politicians, philosophers, political scientists, people of various interests, that somehow before modern Europe, there was Christendom. There was this medieval Christian iteration of Europe that laid the fundamental ground floor for European unity. And so I want to present that idea to you as one that, again, has been really sort of definitive for many discussions about the nature of European civilization. I'll mention right up front, of course, we maybe could have invited like a classicist or a Roman historian. I mean, there is the concept of Europe, of course, as a category in a sort of geographical sense, at least, predates the Middle Ages, as I'm sure many of you know, right? You can go back to Pliny or Roman geographers, and there is some vague sense of Europe. And I'm showing you a T&O map here. This is actually a medieval map, but it's representing a geographical concept that really emerges out of the classical Roman tradition, right? Where you've got your three continents, Africa, Europa, right? Asia, up top. So I just wanted to remind people that you can have discussions about the idea of Europe that predate the Middle Ages, or thinking back to ancient Greece and Persia and all these things like that. However, the scholarship I've read anyway, or discussions that I've been investigating, there seems to be a general agreement that Europe as a meaningful sense of identity, Europe as a meaningful concept, is something that doesn't seem to have a great deal of currency in the Roman era or in the ancient world. It's really in the Middle Ages, it's in the medieval era, that some sense of some bedrock or fundamental essence of European unity comes into being, not back in the Roman period. what does this look like? In a sense, there seems to be kind of two schools of thought, or two arguments, or maybe we could even say two stages in this process, if you're thinking that, or making the claim that Christian Europe somehow preceded modern Europe. The first, of course, and I imagine many of you, you're hanging out in the European studies area, you probably are familiar with this basic idea, right? That of Charlemagne and the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne, who's crowned Roman Emperor on Christmas Day 800, so we're back in the beginning of the 9th century, the early Middle Ages, as it's sometimes called. That Charlemagne, as this Frankish warlord king, crowned Roman Emperor in the year 800, as this ruler, managed to unify an area that seemed to at least encompass much of what we now consider Europe. Sorry, this is not looking so great on this, but you can see here in purple, Carolingian Empire, its greatest extent, with a sense, even down into Italy too, with these sort of satellite kingdoms and affiliated kingdoms and this greater Carolingian orbit. This seems to somehow approximate the area of modern-day Europe. And that Carolingian institutions, Carolingian ideas, Carolingian governance provided a certain appreciable level of coherence and unity to this area that it hadn't really had or possessed since the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. So that's kind of phase one. And I remember, of course, I love to point out, you have the Charlemagne building as part of the European Court with the EU in Brussels. It houses, I think it's the what is it here? The Director of Economic and Financial Affairs, among other things. And this is from, again, sort of 2012 New York Times, getting into the sense of a crisis in Europe. What I see is kind of typical formulation of this that you encounter even in the popular media, right? When Rome collapsed, right, then of course the fall of Rome was a much more complicated process, but you don't need to worry about that in the op-ed piece. The idea is Rome falls apart, right? Europe sank into civil war. Hope centered on those who promised to create the Pax Romana. One is the Catholic Church, with its Latin ritual, more on that in a minute. The other is the Frankish Prince Charlemagne. And this is the key line, right? His realm embraced most of what is today the European Union. So that's kind of phase one, as this era of Charlemagne, who I should mention, in addition to recreating, in addition to sort of bringing about a sense of a Christian empire, is also tapping into this idea of the Roman Empire, which is a whole other strand in the making of Europe that we could explore, but maybe it's not tonight. If you want to then think about a kind of second phase to this process, and full disclosure, this is the one that most of my research focuses on, you might look also towards a second stage of this process in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. So several centuries after the Carolingian era. And instead of being centered, in this case, on an emperor, you wind up looking at this person here in the funny hat, right? The Pope of Rome. I'm featuring Innocent III because his papacy from 1198 to 1216 is typically called out as the kind of high point of the medieval church. Symbolic of the papacy during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Which is a period, to put it in simple terms, is seen as the apex of the Catholic Church in medieval Europe. The period when the popes of Rome are exercising the greatest amount of spiritual, political authority over the area that we now associate with Europe. And the argument, again, is similar, that the regions we associate with Europe today were ones that enjoyed an appreciable level of unity. Why? How? Through a shared language, right? It doesn't matter whether you're in what would become Scotland or what would become Spain or what would become Italy. People are worshiping in Latin. So there's a common liturgical language, everyone's reading their Bible in Latin, they're worshiping in Latin, they're saying their prayers in Latin, and this whole area has a common language. Shared rituals, people are celebrating the Eucharist. Anywhere you go in this area that becomes known as Europe, people are celebrating the Eucharist and baptizing people, more or less using the same ritual formula. Shared tradition of law, right? You have particularly canon law, that certain authoritative legal texts are in widespread use around the area that we associate with Europe. Church councils, you have these actual assemblies of church councils that are bringing clergy from every corner of Europe, right, to these meetings to discuss problems or aspirations for the church. So there's these deliberative bodies that are assembling people. And then, of course, this idea that where do all of these Christians look to as the head of their church? They look to Rome. they look to the Roman Pope, to the Church of Rome. All roads, again, lead to Rome, right? Except now it's not the center of empire, it's the head of the Christian church. And so the idea is that obedience to Rome, in a sense of spiritual devotion to Rome, if you go on pilgrimage, you might go to Rome, that these things are tying the community of Christendom together, specifically Latin or Western Christendom. You've got this whole Eastern Greek tradition over here that is kind of part of this, but not really part of this. This is seen as being a decidedly Western Christian phenomenon. I should mention too, of course, there are shared antagonisms, and I'll say a word about this in a moment when I start to wrap up. The Middle Ages, of course, among other things, are known as an era where you see the origins of the Crusades, these holy wars waged against the Islamic world in the name of recapturing Jerusalem. But whenever you start to invoke medieval Christendom, and I'm showing you this map here with the arrows heading of the routes of the Crusades, as a reminder that the medieval formulation of Christendom is about this common identity within what becomes Europe, but is also about this antagonism or conflict with particularly the Islamic world. So there's a sense of shared antagonism. So we have an idea here that Christendom formed a kind of medieval international community, Christian peoples, Christian kingdoms, tied together by their religious culture, religious institutions. It's a kind of proto-Europe. And I'll mention that this is an idea that, as I mentioned, cuts across the political spectrum. You have sort of 19th century liberals like Lord Acton, saying that medieval Europe fostered this sense of liberty that's essential to European identity. You have these Catholic sort of reactionaries like Joseph de Maistre or Donoso Cortez, who's quoted here. I won't read that, you've probably all read it by now. But people who actually, like de Maistre, is reacting to the chaos, the satanical French Revolution, as he calls it, and looks back to medieval Christian Europe as this time before everything started to fall apart, and something that we might need to move back to. This also includes even Carl Schmitt in the 1920s. You have also 20th century Catholics, kind of progressive Catholics like Christopher Dawson. I really like Christopher Dawson's work, and he looks back to Europe as a time of peace and unity before nationalism and all the ills of the modern world screwed it all up, right? So whether you're a liberal or a reactionary, wherever you fall on the spectrum, you can look back to the Middle Ages as your source of European identity. And I do need to wrap this up in a moment to stay on time, but just this is still going on in modern scholarship. This is from an article on a forerunner of international organizations. This is by Robert Araujo and John Luco from 2004, the Journal of Law and Religion. This chart, by the way, that was based on a book from 1930 called Medieval Internationalism. I've never read it. I didn't even know about it until I was preparing this talk. I already interlibrary loaned it. I'm really excited to see what's going on in that book. But you can see here at a glance this idea that somehow these institutions that characterize Europe are somehow foreshadowed back in the Middle Ages. So I'm going to wrap this up with two critiques. I'm frankly skeptical of a lot of this idea. Let me just say that right now. I think that we should have some skepticism. One reason for that is that this vision of Christendom, it really relies upon a kind of maximalist vision of the church, bordering on totalitarian in some ways, and a maximalist vision of papal authority. That was really in vogue decades ago. That really, you just take it at face value. The Pope's the head of the church, right? The Pope says jump, and everyone in medieval Christian Europe says how high. Needless to say, it was a lot more complicated like that. There's an amazing persistent localism in Europe, and serious limits to what the popes of Rome could ever actually do. They claim these awesome powers and authorities over Christian Europe, but the reality is quite different. So it's kind of a cardboard cutout, almost caricature of the medieval church, that's underpinning this idea of medieval Christendom as a forerunner to medieval, to modern Europe. And I think we also need to be careful, as I mentioned, this also is predicated upon an idea of exclusion, and this gets to this question, which I was talking about with my fellow panelists a moment ago, about, is Europe a Christian club? And part of the answer, when you take this route of looking back to medieval Christendom, is yes, it was a Christian club. And fundamentally, Europe is Christian. If you just kind of scratch the surface, you find Christianity underneath. Where do Jews fit into this? Where do Muslims fit into this? How does this all work? I think that this can take a very a kind of dark turn, so to speak, that we need to be cautious about. I had some things about post-colonialism I want to say too, but you know what? I'm going to try to wrap it up now to stay on time and cede the podium to the next speaker. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to the organisers. I've been involved with European Horizons on and off for about 4 or 5 years. It's delightful to see how much bigger it is. than it has been. It's also nice to see former students in the room from my class on Geographies of Europe. Here we go. So I want to agree entirely with some of the cautions that we've just heard, and the careful nature of the need to think in de-essential terms about what this question means, about this thing, this arena, this area, Europe. And so I want to begin with a question of what is Europe, also where is Europe? Because how we bound that space of Europe also then shapes what we mean by that space of Europe. And what I want to do really is just take a set of simple ideas that have been framed by Calypso Nicolaides at the University of Oxford, in which she has tried to, in a sense, think how in de-essentialized terms, and perhaps even post-colonial terms, we might think of Europe in two different ways. I'll just go through it very quickly. One is that we can think of Europe in ways in which it either becomes a kind of exclusive club, the Club of Europe, or the extent to which it is more inclusive, more open to the world. And so we've got a kind of social inclusiveness, and then we can think of a territoriality. What is the territorial structure that we mean by Europe? And here she says, well, we could think in terms of it being bounded or unbounded. And various conceptions of Europe, one way or the other, think of certain kinds of exclusivity or inclusivity, or boundedness and unboundedness. And what she does is give these terms. So the bounded part of Europe, which is exclusive to itself, we'll call the Euro myth, the myth of the nation state, the myth of Europe as contained within a kind of Western European frame, the myth of a Christian Europe. Or we could think of the bounded inclusive nature, which would be a Euro limes, what she calls the borderlands of Europe, drawing particularly on the work of Etienne Baliban. And so what I'm going to do is unpack these four: Euro myth, Euro limes, Eurospheres, and Euro world fairly quickly. And I'm going to illustrate them. The Euro myth often comes to us in the shape of a set of institutions which have grown over the last 300 or 400 years, in particular around the structures of the territorial national state. And so we tend to think of them, as Benedict Anderson said, the imagined community of the state. And then we can generalize that in terms of an imagined community of Europe with various kinds of origins. And so the Euro myth, in part, is a structure of independent territorial states which constitute together some kind of area we would call Europe, a kind of myth. And that myth has come into being in a variety of ways. We've seen some examples of that, very important ways in which the church and its institutions, the practices that disseminate it, begin to constitute a system of territoriality. Well, so too, by the 1500s, the emergence of that regional identity of Europe was beginning to be institutionalized, beginning to be put in place. Here's a map of Bohemia as the heart of Europe, and here, right at the heart, check which one I'm using here, right at the heart of it is Germania, and here is Gallia, here is Anglia, and here down here is present-day Italy. And so we're beginning to see the body of Europe, the geo-body of a region, to identified here within this princely or queenly figure, with the orb and the scepter, to identify Europe in a very specific kind of way, a kind of mythical Europe which gradually deepens. Here is the very famous picture of Leo Belgicus by Hessel from 1600, and here the body, the territorial body of Belgium and the Low Countries is identified, the geo-body is identified through the body of a lion, powerful, strong identity. And so here what Belgicus is signaling is the emergence of a particular notion of a geo-body. This gets deepened into the 17th and 18th century when the practices of measurement, of mapping, of scripting, of counting, the territory of space begins then to create a certain territorialization of the geobody of the state. Here is the measurement of France, in which engineers are sent out to measure every distance across the country to begin to fix the boundary of a national state that begins to be called itself France. And so we have a kind of notion of a Euro myth that gets extended. It gets extended in various ways through various forms of empire. The King of Sweden, the Russian Empire, the various forms of empire, which begin to create another kind of myth at a different kind of scale. Western Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe. These are constructed. It takes many, many years to construct them, and a lot of effort, a lot of mapping and counting and drawing and institutions, a lot of violence to actually construct those territorial forms. And then they start to have effects. They're mythical, but they have effects, real effects, on how we think. And what Nicolaides suggests is we might want to think with the yin and yang, that when we define something as such, we're also defining its outside. So the yin and the yang is the ball is only meaningful in terms of the space within the ball, the yin and the yang. And so to think of how space gets defined in these mythic terms shapes the way in which we then begin to think and act in the world. So what Nicolaides suggests is that we can move from a bounded notion of exclusivity, this Europe, our Europe, in various ways, and we could think more broadly, what she calls the Euro lines. Let's think with Etienne Balibar in terms of the boundary spaces, the spaces of the limes, which is the boundary of the Roman Empire, if you will. And here, what we have then is, instead of thinking in terms of the geobody of the state of Europe, rather to now begin to think about where Europe begins and ends, and not to fix that, but to leave that open. Whether Europe is bounded by the territorial structure of the European states in this map, or by the Euromed, North Africa, Middle East, now Middle East, already a term which is territorializing, and those areas further east, or whether we begin to think, not a very good map today, where we think of Europe as just a bunch of little peninsulas on the edge of Eurasia, a kind of bounding area in which now here, what we think of as Europe is literally the boundary for Eurasia, the body, the geobody of a larger structure of sensibilities. And what Nicolaides wants us to think about then is what would it take if we think in terms of the Euro lines. Of course, many people have. The famous Ptolemy's geography map from 150 is precisely that kind of Euro-limic thinking. It's not essentializing a particular region, except the region of the known world, and here Europe is very much a kind of boundary edge space, a kind of decentered space on the map with, are you seeing anything here? I'm not. With then what we now think of as the Middle East and Eurasia and the South Asian seas as part of that worldview. Or we can think of Al-Idrisi's map of the world, organized around Mecca, oriented to the south, or oriented to Mecca, again, in which Europe, in this region, is somewhat decentered from the image of the world. Or Hereford Mappa Mundi by the 14th century, in which then the orientation is to Jerusalem, Christian world, but again one in which anything that we think of as Europe, in our terms today, in our fixed terms, and here is Anglia, here is contemporary Germany, and here is the Mediterranean, is decentered by this thinking which is much more, or I would say, geographically open. What then if we come back? Instead of thinking about an inclusive model, which is bounded, think of an unbounded model, which is exclusive, she says. We can think of here the structure of the European Union. It seeks to unbound the spaces of the national state, to broaden them out, to be more open geographically, but it does so in a way which is kind of exclusive. It creates the club of membership in the European Union. So when we think of the European Union and its various expansions, what we see is it can be thought of, as she says, to be structured as a series of spheres. The core area of the European Union and its original member states, the expansion and enlargement of 2004-2007, but also Guyana, the Canaries, and the Azores, territories of member states which are part of the European Union. You can think of those spheres being quite geographically expansive. So when we talk about Europe, what do we mean when we think, for example, of French territories, overseas territories, which are part of the national state of France, or the Dutch territories of the Caribbean, or the Danish dependencies of Greenland and the Faroes, or the Spanish dependencies and territories of Ceuta and Melilla. What kind of geographical imagination is at work when we see that these kinds of spaces extend well beyond any kind of boundary? And this was the second question we were asked to think about, the boundary and the border. And so here we have a kind of notion of opening up of the geography of the border. I think you can think of it in terms of Schengen space too. Here is an unbounded space which unbounds the national territories of the member states of Schengen in order to allow the free movement of people, capital and goods through the territories of the member states. So in that sense it unbounds the space to create a new vision for Europe, but at the same time it is an exclusive space which creates what is often called Fortress Europe, the bounding of that space, of that open terrain. And so we have an exclusive, unbounded space which is gradually beginning to be institutionalized. Here is Hera, here is Artemis, Hermes, Kronos, Poseidon, Neptune, Jupiter, and Mars to the north. Sea gods and planets that structure now the new institutional form of European externalization policy. A new way in which the unbounding of space is beginning to integrate European institutions with those of neighboring territories. The European Neighborhood Program is simply about integrating Euromed and eastern states into a relationship, an uneasy relationship in some cases, with the European Union and member states, and to do so by, in a sense, creating joint military, policing, and customs agreements along this border. So what we have is a kind of expansion of the Eurosphere, and that sphere is beginning then to externalize the border into parts of North Africa and Eastern Europe in very specific kind of ways. What I would say here is that Sandro Mezzadra has coined this the multiplication of borders, because one of the things that's happening in this creation of this particular form of the Eurosphere is new forms of bordering are being produced. The bordering of sea policing, the bordering of territorial management and border and migrant management in Libya, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in as far south as Mali, Senegal. The deployment of Frontex, border guards from Europe in each of those countries of West Africa and North Africa. The deployment of new kinds of border practices internal to Europe now, in order to maintain this exclusivity in this new unbounded space of Schengen. What we see is the deepening of detention centers, the expansion of police cells as places for holding people without papers, or those who are illegalized, or those who seek asylum but haven't found or had their asylum papers processed. So what Mezzadra says is this border is multiplying across the spaces of both inside and outside in this particular Eurosphere. And then we can think perhaps of a more open, welcoming view of this notion of Europe. A notion where welcoming is the model. I think that's precisely the Jean Monnet center model. And here is one of the graphics of a Monet center. The idea that Europe here is not territorially structured and bounded. It's not really the goal here to bound this territory, but to see Europe as a kind of center of possibility, a center of a new kind of ethic towards the outside. I think this is seriously under attack right now and under question from both Brexiteers in Britain, also probably from large parts of the emerging right in Italy, Germany, Hungary, and elsewhere. And this view of a kind of expanded vision of Europe for a kind of global practice is being questioned. But I think the Monet Center here does try to, and we have one here of course, does try to signal this notion of an inclusive and unbounded concept of Europe. That Europe might actually stand for something important. A set of values. I wouldn't want to put them as Christian values. I wouldn't want to say civilizational values. And it's very tricky as to how we name these values. And I think many people in Europe struggle with that because they jump too quickly to naming it as democracy, freedom, enlightenment, and so on. But nonetheless, those kind of struggles that emerge from the formation of the Westphalian state through liberalism to transnationalism do suggest certain possibilities of what Immanuel Kant called cosmopolitanism. Again, I wouldn't want to argue for cosmopolitanism in a Kantian way either, but I would want to suggest that what we see in this notion of Euroworld is a possibility, a new opportunity. If you want to think of borders, let's call it no borders. The movement beyond territorial structures to try to think about responsibility. What Doreen Massey, the geographer, called the geography of responsibility. What is the responsibility of this region, colonial Europe, Enlightenment Europe, site of modernity, to all of those spaces on which its growth depended? What is that responsibility? If you think in terms of exclusive and bounded spaces, then it's the responsibility is one of closure, of defense, of building walls, which is what the Europeans are doing right now in the last few years. If you think in terms of inclusivity and unboundedness, as this map might suggest, then perhaps you have to have a different ethic to the other, a different ethic of the outside, in which the yin and the yang here are not bounded territorially by walls, by papers, by legal rights, but rather by an openness to the unwillingness to the other. And these maps proliferate. Here's GIANT, the Pan-European Research and Education Network, which is very much like the Monet Center, is predicated on this notion of a kind of global network to try to generate a kind of educational nexus of research and training and schooling across a much wider region in which then Europe itself positions itself as a kind of, we might say, I think negative ways, a global leader, but in hopefully in positive ways. Thank you.
I guess I go last because I'm a political scientist and I focus more on contemporary issues of the European Union and European integration, which is my research area, and I'm very pleased to see so many faces here also from the Transatlantic Masters Program. Some of you know that I worked a lot on East and Western Europe, and this is actually kind of my starting point, that I want to argue tonight that the way we think about Europe, it's a social construct, and it's a social construct that is bound to time, to politics, and the time I want to look at is Europe after 1989-90. And just to give you another map here, what I would like to, where I'm starting, so to speak, what I would like to stress here, my starting point is the meaning of Europe until 1989 basically is Western Europe. Western Europe, that's Europe. And you see that on the map here with the European Union, the kind of founding states of the European Union, but also states that are not members of the EU but are Western Europe, like the Scandinavian countries. That was usually referred to as Europe, whereas East Central Europe, like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, under Soviet influence, dominance until 1989, during the Cold War, was usually not called Europe. It was either Eastern Europe, it was the Soviet bloc, it was, you know, something else. And I recall that many years ago when I taught a class in the US, they thought, you know, East Central Europe, that was the Soviet Union, right? It was all, you know, that the Soviet Union would go all the way, this is Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, but it would reach all the way to Germany. And this kind of social construct, the division of Europe, ended with 1989-90, the collapse of communism. And what we see in the 90s is a reconceptualization of Europe. What do we mean by Europe? And more and more, the term meant European Union, right? And so nowadays, the European Union, of course, with 510 million people and 28 members, in fact, covers most of Europe, but not all. There are countries like Norway and Switzerland, but also in Eastern Europe that are Europe but not part of the European Union. But in our kind of conception, this is often kind of conflated, so to speak. But the question is, what does the European Union stand for? What are the values of the European Union? What does this concept stand for in political or political science terms? Let me quickly go back to the Cold War and my favorite city, Berlin, which is kind of a symbol and a site for this division. 1961, the wall went up right downtown in Berlin, and you see, you know, the wall fortified, dividing the city in the 80s here on the right, Potsdam Square. When you visit the city today, it's kind of hard to make out where did the wall stand. But that was the reality in Europe. This is, you know, a kind of the site where you see it most clearly, how people thought about, so to speak, the end of the world. You know, what was behind the Iron Curtain. The term itself is very interesting, the Iron Curtain. When I grew up in Germany as a child, I really thought it was an iron curtain, like, you know, a castle where you have some kind of, you know, iron door or fence or something. And the first time I drove through East Germany with my parents, I kept asking, you know, so where is that curtain, right? Which would divide West and East. So very powerful metaphor. And then, of course, we have the November 9th. What you see here, again, it's Berlin, downtown. This is the wall. And from the west, on the night of November 9th, people would climb up on the wall. And on the eastern side, people were demonstrating in large numbers until finally the East German government consented and said, well, we let East Germans travel to the west. That was a very surprising decision. We can maybe talk in the discussion later about why this happened. But this picture actually is, it's most clearly showing the capture, so to speak, the coming down of the wall through popular uprising, basically. And there was a famous joke back then in 1989, before the wall came down. Erich Honecker, who was the leader of East Germany, dictator, he wakes up in the morning and it's very quiet out in East Berlin. No cars. He looks out of the window, no people, very quiet. And he wonders, you know, what is going on? And he goes down and walks all the way to the Brandenburg Gate, from the eastern side, of course. And there is a sign tacked to the wall, and it says, Erich, you're the last one, switch off the light, right? So this kind of sense of, everybody's leaving, we bring down the wall, was very prominent notion. And it's really a watershed in Europe, so what happens afterwards? And I have here one of the most famous politicians of the post-Cold War era, Václav Havel. He was a Czech, I don't know whether you heard of him or not, but he's a very, very interesting character because he was a playwright in Czechoslovakia. And he joined the group Charter 77 in 1977, demanding human rights and freedom in Czechoslovakia. He was arrested. He was banned from, exercising his profession, writing and staging plays. But in 1989, the Czech Revolution, bringing down communism, brought Václav Havel back to the city of Prague. He became the first president of Czechoslovakia in 1989 of the free new Czechoslovakia. And he was the president of the Czech Republic until 2003. He was I would say he was a political philosopher, an intellectual. He did not only write plays, but he was a real kind of philosophical person. And what I wanted to emphasize here is this is a speech he gave to US Congress in 1990. So immediately after Czechoslovakia opened, communism was gone, he traveled to the West, so to speak, to the United States. And he says Czechoslovakia is returning to Europe. And this notion of the return to Europe is very important. It's not only Havel, you hear it from Arpad Gönc, who was the president of Hungary. You hear it from other people who are building the new democratic systems in East Central Europe. What does that mean? I mean, return. You return to something that you once belonged to. And it's a very interesting notion Havel explained, in several speeches. And what he means is actually, well, East Central Europe has always been part of Europe. Now that communism is gone, we return to the community of countries tied or bound to each other by history, culture, and in particularly enlightenment, right? And so I would say, if you go back to the roots of what is Europe, it's the idea of enlightenment that plays a major role in the rebuilding of East Central Europe. Enlightenment, the notion of freedom, of liberty, of human rights, of democracy, of values that are important in politics. And this is really what I find interesting about this reconstruction of Europe after the Cold War, that the answer to what is Europe seems to be very clear. It's a continent of enlightenment. Christianity does not play a major role here. We're talking about a country, Czechoslovakia, that is very secular. But the kind of values that we see in the French Revolution, that we see in the German Paulskirche 19th century movement for constitutions, for civil liberties, that is what he kind of constructs as the reality, right? It's an ideal, and Havel was very much a person of ideals. Now, you all know that today the situation is quite different, that especially Poland and Hungary are countries we always, quote with, backlash, going back to nationalism, populism, rightist ideas, anti-Semitism, and so on. So the political meaning of Europe today is a bit more complex. It does include the liberal values of enlightenment, but there's also closure and nativism, and the return to Europe, which was so significant in the 1990s, and was a way to construct a new identity after communism, including, you know, the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights, kind of spurred and accelerated the political changes. And in fact, between 2004 and 2013, 12 post-communist countries of East Central Europe did join the European Union. The European Union became kind of the anchor, so to speak, for these countries. If you wanted the democracy, freedom, human rights values, you had to become a member of the European Union. But on the other hand, in all the countries in the region, we see a backlash in the past couple of years to liberal values. Just like I said, you know, right-wing populist parties are on the rise. It's interesting that it's not only Hungary and Poland, it's the Czech Republic, where populists from the right have, you know, won elections. It's Slovakia. You see it, you know, basically in every country in the post-communist world, but also in Western Europe. I mean, it's a shared problem, and the root causes are you know, different, but we also see right-wing populist movements in Western Europe, including France, including Italy, including Germany, even Spain, and you know, this is a much more transnational problem, really. Even though they are nationalistic movements, it's transnational. So that is my closing statement and something for the discussion. While we see the post-communist world establishing democracies after 1989-90, the backlash is a very serious challenge to the political meaning of Europe in the way I just characterized as a Europe of enlightenment and openness and liberty. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you to all of our panelists, and we're going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A. If we can go ahead and shut off.